Welcome if this is your first time, or welcome back if you've been here before. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before. That's great. But I talk a lot about America and its place in the world, usually through a political lens, sometimes through a more sort of social commentary lens, and yeah, that's pretty much what I do here. I'm relatively new to this. I'm kind of still getting the hang of it, but it's been a fun quarantine hobby, and you know, I need those. So today I kind of want to do a sort of broad overview of the separation of church and state and how that concept sort of relates both to American history and to our contemporary political climate. This is kind of sort of part 2 to a 3 or 4, haven't decided yet, part series that I'm doing about morality, moralism, and politics. So if you haven't seen the first video I did, I definitely recommend doing that. I'm gonna put a card somewhere up here. Like I said, I'm new to this, but it's gonna be up there. It does provide some context, and I'm gonna be referencing a lot of the stuff that I talked about there in this video. Just to give you kind of a general idea of what that video is about, I sort of kind of lay the foundation for the conversation I'm gonna have here, or at least continue here, just about how moralistic philosophies and ideas are intrinsically tied to the foundational documents of our country. So to say that morality and politics are inherently separate is, in my opinion, kind of inaccurate, and just kind of asking some questions about what the interconnected nature of morality and politics means for us. Yeah, so, you know, super light stuff, check it out. And I guess that I figured that the last video just wasn't spicy enough. So today I'm going to talk about church and state. Before I get started, I kind of want to clarify, I'm going to be talking about more like overarching conceptual things that most of us have probably already discussed. I kind of wanted to set this video up as a transition between part 1 and part 3. Part 3 is probably going to be a lot longer and more extensive than this video, but I figured that the concept of separating church and state and some of the questions related to that sort of warranted having its own video, just as an attempt to keep my very scattered brain organized. Let's see how that pans out. And the reason I'm trying, I guess, to keep this series as organized as I can, even though I tend to ramble. Morality is really hard to define, right? People have been trying to do that for as long as people have been around, and that makes it even harder to standardize, which is one of the reasons why I find government, law, and politics such an interesting thing to study from both a theoretical and a practical perspective. And that kind of leads to my next point, which is over the course of the thousands and thousands of years that we've been trying to find some sort of way to standardize moral concepts to the extent that people are able to sort of kind of adhere to a consensus about what's moral and what's not, and therefore what is morally enforceable and what's not. I think we've sort of learned through trial and many errors collectively as students of social systems and structures, and I don't just mean someone with a formal education, I mean anyone who considers themselves a student of that. I think collectively we've sort of found by looking at history and even contemporary shit that morality is most effectively standardized when moral concepts and sort of moral ideas can become deeply entwined with our individual sense of identity and therefore enforceable at a systematic level, if that makes sense. What are some of the ways that we as a society are able to get giant groups of people, like hundreds of millions of people, to, for the most part, come to a consensus on big philosophical or moral questions? That's another question that way smarter people than me have been asking and arguing about for a long time. And I think for the most part, the general answer that I've come to is, well, 2 ways. We have religion and we have law. I think that religion and law are the 2 great regulators of both modern society and of society for as long as civilization has been around. And I think that both of those 2 great regulators are inherently moralistic, right? They invoke moralistic ideas and sort of put them into practice and into effect. And I kind of go into the distinction between moralism and morality in my previous video, but I just want to make it really clear that I'm not making any claims about whether religion or law, or a specific religion or a specific law, are inherently moral, but I do believe that to some extent they are moralistic. What's interesting about the two great regulators of religion and law is that the general consensus among political theorists and sociologists and pretty much anyone who studies any aspect of civilization is that they tend to work best when they're kept separate, hence the separation of church and state. So obviously I'm going to be looking at this through the lens of American history and politics. Just want you guys to keep that in mind. But the most straightforward way that the US law calls specifically for the separation of church and state is right at the beginning, right in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And it states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This small sentence does two extremely important things. It guarantees the freedom of anyone in America to practice any religion, and it prohibits the state from establishing a state religion. Conceptually, these are both obviously extremely important. And I think they also, when you take into account the practicality of American history, they beg a really important question. In a state where laws are made by people, and in a world where people's moral identities are, for the most part, or at least 250 years ago, were intrinsically tied to their religious beliefs, how true is that in practice? And that's especially important when you take into account that for the vast majority of American history, all of our lawmakers belong to the same religion. It was fairly recent when we started to see more diverse representation in our legislative branch, but even then, our representatives at the lawmaking or legislative level are predominantly members of only one religion. I just want to make something super clear. I'm not here to make any statements or qualifications about religion. All I want to do is ask a question. And that question is how exactly we can guarantee that the laws of a country are completely separate and completely uninfluenced by a specific religion if the vast majority of legislators over the course of that country's history have belonged to one overarching religion. And that's not a leading question. I'm not trying to imply anything with that question. I'm literally just asking because I think it's a really worthwhile conversation to have, right? And I think it's a pretty widely accepted idea that religion has influenced parts of our political system. Not that religion has been indoctrinated into our political system, but that at least religious influences have become a part of the verbiage that's used, right? All men are created equal, or one nation under God, or in God we trust. Those, I'm not saying whether those statements are good or bad inherently. That's not my place to say by any means. I'm just pointing out that there are religious undertones to a lot of sort of official language within our political system. And I think a lot of other political students and theorists would even go so far as to say that religious ideas, or at least more fundamentalist and traditionalist religious ideas, have played a part in the legislative process itself, right? I mean, gay marriage, for example, was legalized 5 years ago in a country that is nearly 250 years old. And to this day, a lot of the arguments against the legalization of gay marriage have to do with a very traditionalist vision of marriage as sort of a religiously relevant concept. Again, I'm not here to make any moral qualifications by any means. I'm just pointing out that I do think there is a documented history of there being echoes of traditionalist, conservative religious beliefs within our legislative system. So what does that mean for our national identity? Obviously, the United States has been at least perceived as sort of this international beacon of diversity and this haven for immigrants for at least the past 110, 120 years or so. The accuracy of that is something for another day. But I think it's safe to say that that has sort of been the country's international reputation for quite a while. Since the late industrial age, people of all different cultures and belief systems have come to this country in pursuit of a better life. My opinion is that that is what makes this country great. And obviously, you know, as different cultures and backgrounds mix, as technology and innovation increase exponentially, as our capitalistic market becomes increasingly competitive and globalized, we stray further and further from the religious homogeneity that was the reality when the Constitution was written. And yes, I just said that this country was religiously homogenous, especially when compared to how it is nowadays, back when the Constitution was written. I really want to take a second to acknowledge that there were hundreds of thousands of Native American peoples and enslaved peoples who had varied cultural and religious practices. Those existed, those were very important, and they have been passed down through generations. However, Native people and enslaved people were not represented in the foundation of our government. Their religious practices were not influences in the writing of our Constitution, nor were these groups granted the right to participate directly in our government for many, many years. So I just want to point out that 250 years ago, our country was not religiously homogenous, but, relatively speaking, our lawmakers and the people who they considered to be their constituents were. As our society becomes more and more complex, as representation of religious minorities increases in our legislative system, more and more discourse happens around concepts that might have been accepted as objectively true prior. Now, of course, the fact that this kind of discourse can happen, the fact that people of varied backgrounds have avenues for political participation and even legislative representation, is a testament to the fact that our Constitution was really effective at allowing there to be a true separation of church and state. However, the fact that purely religious arguments are still impactful considerations when it comes to passing or blocking laws within our legislative system also goes to show that we have by no means achieved a perfect, seamless separation of church and state. Some would argue that this is a good thing because the religion that has been represented in the majority of our legislators up until now has been a means by which to stick to moral absolutes that should not be forgotten or challenged. Others would argue this is a bad thing for a few reasons, not the least of which is that the government's association, however loose and however implicit with one specific religion over time, has ostracized or even alienated members of other religions. Some would say that our legislative body is more diverse than ever. There are people of various religious backgrounds who are currently representatives at the federal level. Others would argue that 88% of the members of our legislative body still belong to one major religion, and that is not reflective of the American population, and therefore it is inherently leaning a little bit more toward that one religion. And because, proportionally speaking, that isn't representative of the American population, our legislative body is still more associated with one given religion than it would be if there were an absolute separation of church and state. I think it's a lot more productive and interesting if this is a conversation rather than me talking at you about what I think, because I think, and this is turning out to be my favorite word, but it's a very nuanced and complicated conversation. But I would really love to know what you think about that. Where do you think our separation of church and state lies? Where do you think we have room for improvement? Do you think we have reached an absolute separation of church and state relative to other countries in the world? Some might say that America is a paragon of a separation between church and state. Some, looking at other examples of countries in the world, would say that we are still deeply tied to religious foundations. So, which is it? With this video, I just really wanted to introduce the idea of a separation between church and state, as well as our country's history of sort of having implicit religious concepts affecting our legislative system and our political system at large. Next week, or maybe the week after, depending on how long the footage turns out to be, I am going to be exploring our move towards increasingly stronger polarization, sort of from the very beginning, from those moralistic roots that we talked about in the last video to now. The question of separation of church and state becomes really important when we're talking about that, because anything that is deeply tied into constituents' identity, right, their moral beliefs, is going to be touchy. Like, I know that this is a touchy subject. I tried to handle it as tactfully and objectively as possible, but I think that one of the reasons we've become so polarized is because it is so difficult to have discourse when there are disagreements about things that people consider to be fundamental aspects of their identity. And I think that a two-party system combined with moralistic ideas, combined with identity politics, have all sort of formed a recipe for that over time. Yeah, that's kind of the plan. I hope this video was clear and productive and helpful. I hope that I was able to stay objective. Like I said, my goal is never to sit here and trash any one given topic, because I think that there's a lot of room for conversation and nuance in pretty much anything I talk about here. I just wanted to present some questions that I think are important to consider as we move forward with these topics, and I hope I did an okay job at that. But if you're still here, thank you so much for powering through that. Make sure that you leave me a comment. Seriously, I would really like to know what your thoughts are on this, because it's such a heavy and complicated topic. So I think the more discourse we have about it, the better. And real quick, thank you so much to Valeria for bringing up the idea of, morality and religion and how those two impact our government. I'm so glad that you brought that up after I posted the last video, because I think it's such an interesting topic. I could keep going on and on about it, but I'm gonna try to stop here. But thank you so much for watching and for bringing that up. And thank you for watching. If you're still here, I really appreciate it. And we'll see you either next Tuesday or the Tuesday after that. Have a good one.